Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhaso, and this morning we'll be looking at the first half of the Sabbāsava Sutta, one of the principal discourses of the Buddha, a very important discourse of the Buddha. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the first half of the discourse and give some explanations. And if there's any questions, I'll respond to those at the end. And then we'll be doing the second half of the sutta in 2 days, on Friday morning. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sammasambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So, as mentioned, we're looking at the first half of the Sabbāsava Sutta. This is from the Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 2. And the title, Sabbāsava, is a compound of the word sabbā, which means all or every or entire, and asava. So the word asava is translated in various ways. Bhante Bodhi had translated asava as taint, which is okay. In the translation I'll be looking at this morning, Bhante Sujatra's translation, it's translated as defilement, which is also decent. Other ways of translating the word asava are things like corruption, or pollutant, or contaminant, all of which I think are also quite good. Lately I've been experimenting with the word sewage as a translation for asava, which is cute but a little bit more divergent from its usage. The word asava is sometimes translated very literally as influx, because it seems to be from a verb root which means flowing, which indicates movement, and particularly movement of water. But the actual usage of the word asava is about contaminant, or something which pollutes or contaminates or corrupts the mind. That's how we get to a word like sewage. So we have flowing water that's contaminated and polluting. But here it's translated as defilements, which is decent enough. So this is a discourse about many of the different ways that the mind becomes defiled or contaminated, and about ways of purifying the mind of those contaminants depending upon the particular circumstances. So one of the things about the Buddha's teachings is that the Buddha doesn't give only one way of training the mind. The Buddha gives many, many different ways of training the mind. And depending upon the specific defilements or particular situation that we're in, then we apply different tactics, different strategies for purifying the mind. So this particular discourse, the Buddha gives 7 different strategies for purifying the mind of its contaminants, of its defilements. And the first section is much longer than the following 6, so today we'll be just going through the first section of the sutta, which is about half the length of the sutta. And then on Friday we'll go through the other 6. So I'll go ahead and start reading through the discourse and giving some explanations as we go along. So the discourse begins. Thus have I heard. At one time the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery. So this was where the Buddha gave most of the recorded discourses that we have. So it says, there the Buddha addressed the mendicants. So mendicants here is the literal translation of the word bhikkhu. So bhikkhu literally means beggar, one who begs for alms food, so an alms mendicant. And one important point, by the way, is that in Pali language, whenever a mixed gender group is being referred to in the Pali language, one always uses the masculine plural form. So in the suttas we often see there the Buddha addressed the bhikkhus, but it should be understood that the masculine plural indicates a mixed gender group of people. So this means that there may have also been bhikkhunis present, but because of the structure of the Pali language, that's not specified. most of the time. So it says, there the Buddha addressed the mendicants. Mendicants, Venerable Sir, they replied. And the Buddha said this, Mendicants, I will teach you the explanation of the restraint of all defilements. Listen and apply your mind well. I will speak. Yes, sir, they replied. That's yes, Bhante. So yes, Bhante, they replied. And the Buddha said this, Mendicants, I say that the ending of defilements is for one who knows and sees, not for one who does not know or see. For one who knows and sees what? And in Pali, the next line says, Yoniso manasikara and ayoniso manasikara, which Bhante Suddhaso translates as rational application of mind and irrational application of mind. And this is a very interesting way of translating yoniso manasikara, but not necessarily one that I agree with. Yoniso manasikara is a compound of the word yoniso. Yoniso means based on the origin or source, or based on the cause. So the word yoni literally means womb, as in a woman's womb, that from which things are born. And so then in applied usage, the word yoni also then means the origin of things, the source of things, the causal basis for things. So yoniso means based upon the causal basis, so from an understanding of causality. And manasikara is a compound of manasi, which means in the mind or with the mind, and kara, which means activity or doing, construction. So manasikara then means applying the mind or using the mind in a way which is yoniso, a way which is based upon an understanding of causality. So translating it as rational application of mind requires a bit of explanation, because in particular it means applying one's mind based upon a wise understanding of cause and effect, a wise understanding of how particular causes create particular results. And this is important because an understanding of causality is one of the critical underpinnings of all Buddhist thought and practice. In fact, one of the defining characteristics of the Buddha's teachings is that every single thing is governed by cause and effect. So nothing is random or chaotic, but rather it's all manifestations of causality, of cause and effect. And a correct understanding of cause and effect then leads us to understand that the purity or impurity of the mind is an effect. The wisdom or foolishness of the mind is an effect. The happiness or depression of the mind is an effect. And all of those effects have particular causes. So if we create the corresponding causes, then we will get the corresponding effects. So this then is the basis of yoniso manasikara. So application of the mind based on an understanding of causality. We think, well, we want to be wise and happy and peaceful. Well, then we need to create the corresponding causes that will lead to those desirable effects. So yoniso manasikara means to apply the mind in a way that it will create the causes for the kinds of effects that we want. So Bhante Bodhi had originally translated yoniso manasikara simply as wise attention, which is capturing the wisdom aspect of this, and that it's based upon a wise understanding of causality. However, translating manasikara as simply as attention is a bit limited. So again, manasikara literally means mental activity. Bhante Suddhaso translated it here as application of mind, which is quite accurate. So applying the mind or using the mind in a way which is based on a wise understanding of causality, so that we can get the effects that we want, the desirable effects that we seek. Which in a Buddhist context is particularly the effects of wisdom, serenity, happiness, and purity of mind. So coming back to the sutta, then the Buddha continues. The Buddha says, when you apply the mind irrationally, so again, when you apply the mind without an understanding of causality, the Buddha says, defilements arise, and once arisen, they grow. And he says, when you apply the mind rationally, so that is, when you apply the mind with an understanding of causality, then defilements do not arise, and those that have already arisen are given up. So here again, the Buddha is laying out a basic framework of thought, which is really critical in Buddhist practice. It's the understanding that defilements arise based upon causes and conditions, and in particular, what decisions we make with our mind affect whether defilements appear and grow, or whether they fade and disappear. And so then the Buddha here lays out a list of the different strategies that he's going to describe in the course of the sutta. So as prior mentioned, there's 7 distinct strategies, and today we'll be going through the first of the 7, and the other 6 we'll go through in a couple of days. So the Buddha says, some defilements should be given up by seeing, some by restraint, some by using, some by enduring, some by avoiding, some by dispelling, and some by developing. And he'll be defining all 7 of these terms in detail. But it is, first of all, it is important to note that here he's giving 7 distinct situations. And the strategy that is relevant is quite different. For example, enduring and avoiding are quite different. Do you endure a situation and purify the mind through enduring? Or do you avoid a situation because it's easier to purify the mind by avoiding a situation, for example? These seem to be 2 polar opposite approaches. So it depends upon a wise understanding of the circumstances. So understanding the cause-effect relationship of whatever the current circumstance we're in is, and how that relates to the purification of the mind. But we'll start with the first one, which will take us plenty of time as it is. So the first one is defilements to be given up by seeing. So asava dasana pahataba. And dasana is translated here as seeing, which is quite literal. But it's important to understand that this doesn't necessarily mean seeing with one's eyes, but rather it means one's viewpoint, one's worldview. So in the suttas, seeing or viewing or view is often used to talk about one's mental point of view, one's way of thinking about the world, one's way of relating to the world, one's internal mental framework for comprehending and understanding the world. So it doesn't necessarily literally mean what you're looking at, but rather it means how you relate to the world, how you conceive of the world. So the Buddha says, what are the defilements that should be given up by seeing? And the first one, he says, take an uneducated, ordinary person. So this means someone who has not heard the Dhamma, who hasn't learned the Dhamma. So the Pali word is asuttava patujana. Asuttava literally means one who has not heard. So specifically, one who has not heard the Dhamma, one who has not learned the Buddha's teachings. And patujana means ordinary people, common folk. So putu means broad or widespread, and jana means populace, generation. So patujana means the widespread people, the ordinary people. And in the suttas, the term patujana particularly means people who have not attained any stage of awakening. People who are living ordinary lives which are not necessarily based on spiritual principles. In other words, most people. So the Buddha says, take an uneducated ordinary person who has not seen the noble ones and is neither skilled nor trained in the teaching of the noble ones. They have not seen good people and are neither skilled nor trained in the teaching of good people. So noble ones in Pali is Arya. And again, this is usually used to refer to people who have attained some stage of awakening, whether it's stream entry or all the way up to full awakening. And the term good people or true people in Pali is Sappurisa. And this is used a little bit more broadly. So in some places in the sutta, Sappurisa is defined in a way which seems to indicate it's talking about people who also have some stage of awakening. But in other places, Sappurisa is used in a more broad sense to mean someone who is committed to goodness, committed to moral purity, committed to truth, committed to wisdom. So someone with a genuine, sincere commitment to spiritual development, to progressing towards complete purity of heart. So the ideal situation, of course, is that one sees awakened beings, one learns the Dhamma from awakened beings. Second best is to spend time in the company of really good people, really pure-hearted people with a genuine commitment to spiritual truth. And one learns from those sorts of people as well. But here the Buddha is talking about somebody who does not learn the Dhamma from awakened beings and does not learn the Dhamma from good people. So they're lacking good spiritual guidance in their life. And the Buddha says this person does not understand to which things they should apply the mind and to which things they should not apply the mind. So again, this is manasikara. So what things should we apply the mind towards and what should we not? And the Buddha says, so they apply the mind to things they shouldn't and do not apply the mind to things they should. And so, once again, we're talking about things which lead to the increase of defilements or things which lead to the decrease of defilements. And the Buddha says, what are the things to which they apply the mind but should not? They are the things that, when the mind is applied to them, give rise to unarisen defilements and make arisen defilements grow. The defilements of sensuality, the desire for existence, and the defilement of ignorance. And the Buddha says, these are the things to which they apply the mind but should not. So again, this is emphasizing that when we direct the mind towards particular things, when we apply the mind in particular ways, then that leads to an increase in our obsession with sensuality. It leads to our obsession with existence, with states of being, with self-identity. And it leads to the increase in ignorance. For example, if you spend all day watching TV, then what's going to happen? Well, your obsession with sensuality might increase, your self-identity might grow, and your ignorance will definitely increase, will definitely grow. You'll become increasingly delusional. So just as one example of this. And the Buddha continues, what are the things to which they do not apply the mind but should? And they are the things that, when the mind is applied to them, do not give rise to unarisen defilements and give up arisen defilements. Again, this is what we should be using the mind for. We should be using the mind in a way that leads to the reduction of our defilements, and not in a way that leads to their increase. And so the Buddha says, because of applying the mind to what they should not, and not applying the mind to what they should, unarisen defilements arise, and arisen defilements grow. So again, emphasizing the point. When we use the mind without a wise understanding of causality, then we might apply the mind in ways that lead to an increase in our defilements, that make the mind more corrupted, that make our heart more corrupted rather than more pure. And this is the case of most ordinary people in the world. So in pursuit of ordinary worldly goals, ordinary worldly pleasure, ordinary people then are constantly increasing their defilements. They're increasing their obsession with sensuality, increasing their obsession with self-identity, and increasing their delusion, their misunderstanding of the nature of happiness and wisdom. And so then the Buddha gives some examples. He says, this is how they apply the mind irrationally. So, ayoniso manasikara. This is how they apply the mind without a wise understanding of causality. And he gives some examples of someone thinking, did I exist in the past? Did I not exist in the past? What was I in the past? How was I in the past? After being what did I become in the past? Will I exist in the future? Will I not exist in the future? What will I be in the future? How will I be in the future? After being what will I become in the future? Or they are undecided about the present thus. Am I? Am I not? What am I? How am I? This sentient being, where did it come from? And where will it go? So these are all examples of forms of speculation, speculation based upon a sense of self. So all of these are arising from some underlying assumption that I am an ongoing, permanent being, that I have some kind of separate individual existence. So all of these speculative views that the Buddha is talking about are all arising from self-centeredness. They're all arising from self-attachment, from self-identity, which is the root of all of our suffering. All of our suffering arises from self-identity. So the Buddha then explains in more detail. He says, when they apply the mind irrationally in this way, one of the following 6 views arises in them and is taken as a genuine fact. And here follows 6 examples of self-identity, 6 ways of relating to self-identity, all of which, from the Buddhist standpoint, are considered incorrect. So, first one, he says, the view, myself survives. Second one, the view, myself does not survive. So in Pali, this is atti me atta and natti me atta. So atti me atta literally means there is a self for me. So I have a self. And the second one is natti me atta, which means there is no self for me. I do not have a self. So atta means self or soul. So the translation here, myself survives and myself does not survive, is interesting but a little bit difficult to justify. Atti me atta, saying, I have a self. I have a soul. There's something permanent and stable and ongoing which is genuinely me, my true self. The second one is saying, I do not have a self. So this might seem a bit puzzling for those who are familiar with Buddhist thought. It seems like saying, I do not have a self. It seems like that would be correct. It seems like that would be a way of talking about anatta, non-self. But the problem here is that it's still arising from a place of self-identity. I do not have a self. So it's still coming from the underlying assumption of self-existence, the underlying belief in I and me and mine. I do not have my self. There is no self for me. So this is still an incorrect view because it's still based ultimately in self-identity. So it's a step in the direction of truth, but it's still thoroughly rooted in wrong view, the wrong view of self-existence, of self-identity. So then the third wrong view is, I perceive the self with the self. So this one clearly wrong. So believing we have our true self, our true nature, and it's perceiving our true self. The fourth one, I perceive what is not self with the self. So again, there's an element of wisdom here, and that one recognizes that some aspect of our experience is not me, not mine. But we believe through the avenue of my true self, of who I am, then I perceive the things which are not me, not myself. So it's still coming from that place of self-identity. And then the fifth one, I perceive the self with what is not self. So again, it's still this fixation on self, the fixation on me, who I am, what I am. Still this self-centered fixation at the core of how we're relating to the world. And then the sixth wrong view that the Buddha mentions, he says, or they have such a view. The self of mine is he, the speaker, the knower, who experiences the results of good and bad deeds in all the different realms. This self is permanent, everlasting, eternal, and imperishable, and it will last forever and ever. So the sixth one is once again very clearly incorrect from the standpoint of Buddhist doctrine. So this is someone who believes that, again, their true self, whatever they think their true self is permanent, it's eternal, it's undying. It will last forever. And this eternal true self of theirs is wandering through all the different realms of existence and experiencing good and bad results of karma. So again, there's an element of right view mixed in here. So there's an element of right view in that in this perspective, one is still recognizing karma and rebirth. So karma and rebirth as being some of the critical central components of right view in Buddhism. So this person is recognizing, yes, there are good and bad deeds, good and bad karma, that does produce good and bad results. I am experiencing the good and bad results of my own good and bad karma, going through different realms of rebirth, experiencing karma. So that's all actually okay. The problem is that this person also has the view that this person who goes from life to life is permanent and eternal. So there's some kind of ongoing, genuinely existent true self, which is moving from life to life. So that's where the wrong view gets mixed in this sixth one. So part of what makes several of these wrong views challenging is that many of them actually contain elements of wisdom. And this can then make it quite deceptive to the mind. The mind picks up the element of wisdom, but then doesn't recognize the element of delusion that's been mixed in with it. So then the Buddha says, this is called a misconception, the thicket of views, the desert of views, the twist of views, the dodge of views, the fetter of views. Again, the word here is ditti, which is related to the word dasana, which means seeing. So ditti is a view, a viewpoint, a perspective, a worldview, a concept. So these are all views, viewpoints, which are based upon self-identity, based upon attachment to the sense of selfhood, of individual self-existence. And the Buddha says, the uneducated ordinary person who is fettered by views is not freed from birth, aging, and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and despair. They are not freed from suffering, I say. So in other words, if one is still holding on to any of these wrong views around self-existence, then one will continue to cycle through the round of rebirth. One will continue to experience birth, aging, sickness, and death. One will continue to experience sorrow and pain and despair, all the various shades of dukkha, all the various shades of dissatisfaction and discontent. But then the Buddha gives the positive side of this. He says, but take a learned disciple of the noble ones, who has seen the noble ones, who is skilled and trained in the teaching of the noble ones, who has seen true people, good people, and is skilled and trained in the teaching of good people. And they understand what things they should apply the mind to and what things they should not apply the mind to. So they apply the mind to things that they should and do not apply the mind to things they should not. And as before, the Buddha explains that one should not apply the mind to things that increase one's defilements, and one should apply the mind to things that diminish one's defilements. And so he says, because of not applying the mind to what they should not, and applying the mind to what they should, unarisen defilements do not arise, and arisen defilements are given up. And here he explains how to apply the mind correctly. So when one has a wise understanding of causality, of cause and effect, then one wants to apply the mind in a way that will reduce one's defilements, that will therefore reduce one's suffering, and lead to an increase in wisdom, an increase in serenity, an increase in happiness. And ultimately, one is trying to create the causes which lead to full awakening, the completion of the spiritual journey. And so the Buddha says that the proper ways to apply the mind, he says, one rationally applies the mind. So based on a wise understanding of causality, one applies the mind in this way. This is dukkha. This is the origin of dukkha. This is the cessation of dukkha. This is the practice that leads to the cessation of dukkha. So in other words, rather than speculating about self-identity, rather than speculating about what we were in the past and what we will be in the future and what we are now. Instead of forming different philosophical viewpoints around self-existence, instead we should just be constantly examining our experience in terms of the Four Noble Truths. So constantly looking in each moment, looking to see, what is the dukkha? Where is the dukkha right now? Where is the dukkha that's currently being experienced by the mind? So we identify the dukkha and we try to understand it completely. We examine it thoroughly. And we look to see, what is the causal basis of this dukkha? Again, yoniso manasikara is all about applying the mind based upon a wise understanding of causality. So when we're looking at dukkha, we need to understand what its cause is. So we look for the dukkha in the mind, and we identify some discomfort or displeasure in the mind. Well, then we look to see, well, what's causing it? What's the causal basis of this displeasure? So that's looking at the origin of dukkha, the origin of suffering. And invariably, of course, it's always based on in some shade of desire, aversion, or delusion. So recognizing the origin of dukkha. And we apply the mind to understanding the ending of dukkha, the cessation of dukkha. So recognizing that when we diminish our desire, aversion, and delusion, when we cultivate contentment, kindness, and wisdom, then our dukkha diminishes, our suffering diminishes. The mind becomes increasingly happy and serene. And one applies the mind to understanding how to practice in a way that leads to the diminishing and cessation of dukkha. So recognizing that when we follow the Buddha's instructions, when we practice morality, concentration and wisdom, when we cultivate 7 factors of awakening and so on, then that all creates the necessary conditions for our dukkha to diminish, for our wisdom to increase, and for the path towards awakening to be traveled along. And in the second half of the sutta, the Buddha will go through several practical examples of how to apply this in a variety of different situations. So this first half of the sutta here is giving the philosophical or conceptual framework, which will then be laid out in practical specific examples over the second half of the sutta. So for now we'll look at the final statement of this first section. The Buddha says, as they do so, they give up 3 fetters, which in Pali are sakkaya ditthi, vicikiccha, and silabbata paramaso. And Bhante Suddhaso translates these as substantialist view for sakkaya ditthi, doubt for vicikiccha, and misapprehension of precepts and observances for silabbata paramasa. And the Buddha says these are called defilements that should be given up by seeing. So going into a detailed description of the 3 fetters would take quite some time, but just briefly. Silabbata paramasa is translated here as misapprehension of precepts and observances, which is quite good. So silabbata paramasa is talking about not understanding how to use spiritual practices correctly. So not understanding that the purpose of spiritual observances, of precepts and vows, the purpose of rituals and practices is to help with purifying the mind. And that it's not necessarily the physical activity itself that's important, but rather it's the purification of the heart. So working to diminish one's defilements, that's what's really important. And vicikiccha is doubt or skepticism. So in particular, it's doubt about the accuracy of the Dhamma. Skepticism about the accuracy of the Dhamma. And so what the Buddha is saying here is that when we constantly contemplate the Four Noble Truths, then eventually we come to see that they are irrefutably correct. They're absolutely undeniable. And with that realization, then one's doubt drops away. There's no longer any doubt about the accuracy of the Dhamma, because all of the Dhamma is based upon the Four Noble Truths. So once we come to a reflective acceptance of the Four Noble Truths, an experiential confirmation of the Four Noble Truths, then naturally our doubt about the Dhamma evaporates. And Sakkaya Ditthi is a bit more complex to explain. So in the suttas, Sakkaya Ditthi is defined as perceiving the body and mind as self. So perceiving any element of the body or mind as being me or mine. So thinking this body is me, these feelings are me, these perceptions are me, these ideas are me, this consciousness is me. Those are all examples of Sakkaya Ditthi. So it's translated here as substantialist view, which is a very cute translation, but doesn't actually clarify what Sakkaya Ditthi means. We still need to explain what is meant by substantialist view. So Sakkaya Ditthi, once again, means identifying as body and mind, or any particular component of body and mind. That's what's meant here by Sakkaya Ditthi, or substantialist view. So that's the end of the first section of the Sabbāsava Sutta. So at this time we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll take any questions that have been typed in. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So hello to the people who have checked in online. Hello to Gita, Rebecca, Manal, Mike, Madeline, Sud, Ming, Jody, Bhumika, Tora, Olga, Karuna, Bhante Sankicha. Hello, Bhante. Jayanta and Wikum. Good to see all of you joining in. And I see a question here from Sud. So Sud asks, how does a patujana give rise to yoniso manasikara? Or is it just reserved for those who already had seeing, aka stream entry? Or is yoniso manasikara just the act of turning the mind away from sensuality? So, first off, no, yoniso manasikara is not exclusively the domain of stream enterers. So yoniso manasikara is in fact a critical element of Buddhist practice, right from the beginning. And it's also not specifically about turning the mind away from sensuality. So yoniso manasikara, at its most basic level, is recognizing that there is a cause-effect relationship to every choice that we make, including mental choices. So how we choose to direct our mind affects what will happen to us in the future. And especially important from the Buddhist standpoint is understanding that how we direct our mind affects whether or not our defilements increase or decrease. How we apply our mind affects whether the heart becomes more pure or less pure. How we apply our mind affects whether we move towards awakening or away from awakening. That's the basic critical principle of yoniso manasikara. It's understanding that there is actually a consequence to every single decision that we make, whether with body or mind. So yoniso manasikara then, based upon that understanding that there is actually a causal consequence to every single choice that we make with body or mind, then we want to apply our mind to make mental choices that lead to a decrease in our defilements, an increase in our purity, a decrease in our delusion, an increase in our wisdom. So one application of that is in fact in trying to avoid mental choices that increase obsession with sensuality. But that's only one specific example. It's any mental choice which directs the mind away from awakening. We want to avoid making those kinds of choices. And any mental choice which points the mind towards awakening, we want to make those kinds of choices instead. So that's yoniso manasikara. So yoniso manasikara is a necessary part of Buddhist practice from day one all the way up to full awakening. And Sud asks, how does one give rise to seeing the Dhamma, aka stream entry? Well, the Buddha actually says in the sutta, he says that it is through wise examination of the Four Noble Truths, constantly applying the mind in line with the Four Noble Truths. And that the fourth truth is the Noble Eightfold Path. So continually contemplating the Four Noble Truths, examining our moment-to-moment experience through the lens of the Four Noble Truths, and constantly living the Noble Eightfold Path as thoroughly and completely as we can. That is what leads to stream entry. And that looks like the last question online. So once again, we'll be doing the second half of the sutta the day after tomorrow, Friday morning at this time. We'll be going through the rest of this magnificent discourse. So for now, we can go ahead and conclude with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.